Welcome to Daily Grace. We're glad you're with us here. We hope, whether you're watching it live or tuning in later, that it is a moment of grace in your day, that you're built up. We got Ben Hendricks with us. Ben.
Hey guys, how are you?
All right, here's what we've got going on today. You might have seen it in the text, or maybe you're catching this later. I was talking to my buddy the other night. He pastors in Florida, and he said, if you want to understand 2020, read this book. Well, thankfully, I'd already read the book, because that's a pretty big claim. Maybe you haven't, and we thought, well, let's talk together a little bit about it. The book is called The Coddling of the American Mind. The Coddling of the American Mind. And the subtitle is How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. Now, that's a big title, subtitle, and maybe it's true, maybe it's not. It obviously doesn't account for God's grace. But how good intentions and bad ideas are setting up a generation for failure. So what we're going to do is I'm really going to ask Ben to lead us through the book, because he's read it. I read it also, but he actually has just prepared he led us pastors through it. We were earlier in the week on a little pastor's retreat. So here's the last thing I'll do is tell you who wrote it, and then I'll ask you about it. So Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt. Greg Lukianoff is the founder of a thing called the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, so specifically universities, F-I-R-E, FIRE.
Wow.
No, anyway, that's Lukianoff. And then Jonathan Haidt is a professor at NYU's Stern School of Business. He's a psychologist by training. And both of them are, it's not a Christian book, but it comes at where are we in our cultural moment. And they focus specifically on sort of the iGen generation, or Generation Z, the younger generation. But we're going to talk about all of us, because I think we're all in danger of being coddled or of being around this. And what does it mean? So they give us three great untruths that are animating our time.
Well,
what are they?
First, props to you for the pronunciation of their names, man.
Well, I'm hoping they don't know. Maybe I got it wrong.
You sound confident. You sounded good. So I read this book probably about a year ago, and I just somewhat similar. It seemed like this kind of this. If you want to understand the culture that we're in right now, here's a couple good ways to do that. And so the premise of The Coddling of the American Mind is, and I love the way they put it, good intentions and bad ideas that are setting up our generation for failure. So untruths that culture has created along the way that are deemed necessary and true, but in reality are detrimental and end up being lies. And so what they've come up with is three untruths. So usually when we look at a worldview or a culture, we look at the three truths or a couple truths of here's what they believe, here's what they hold on to, here's kind of definitive of who they are. These two authors look at three great untruths that our culture along the way have come up with that are very definitive of where we find ourselves now.
And untruths that are being propagated as truths.
Yep, absolutely.
So it's a false worldview, but they're showing it.
And so I'll give you the first, kind of all three of them, and then we'll walk through them really quickly. That the first is the untruth of fragility, the idea of what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. The second is the untruth of emotional reasoning. Always trust your feelings.
That's not true?
Oh, man.
Wait a minute.
If only it was. And then the last one is the untruth of us versus them, one that I think we all see so much going on right now, which is life is a battle between good people and evil people. And so that very first truth is the untruth of fragility. Really, the very premise of is people, specifically children, are fragile and must be treated as such. And it starts all the way from the 1950s that when we really start having this idea of safety, of look, we need to make things safer for our kids and for the population. And those are good and right. That was a good motivation. But this idea of concept creep, where a good idea over a long time can end up being something very different than what it originated, ends up leading us into the early 2000s, where we start redefining words like harmful and redefining things like trauma, where it becomes more about what we experience and how we feel than just physical safety, where the definition used to be. And so by the early 2000s, safety became sacred. And it created a culture that the book, and a lot of us already have probably heard before, which is safetyism. A culture or belief system in which safety has become a sacred value, where we put safety as the thing that we have to get to, where it's the idea that safety will bring our lives flourishing. It's where success, it's where the best way to raise our kids is ultimately to create the safest environment possible. And what they're saying is this is an untruth, that it comes from this foundation of that our kids are inherently fragile things, and that there is no good suffering, there is no good difficulty, and that no matter how much, or that like whether we are, if there's suffering at all or any difficulty, it can there's no possibility of it ever bringing a good outcome. And then through a couple of chapters or so, they kind of really show us how that's untrue.
And they actually coin a term, or at least for me they did, and maybe it's out there, but
Yeah.
Are humans fragile? They say no, they're not fragile, they're anti-fragile,
Yep.
meaning like resilient isn't even maybe strong enough a term, but they can overcome what hurts them. But that's
Yep.
not what our culture is telling us. If you're hurt, you're going to be a victim, or
Yep.
you're going to be doomed to the wounds of that and the scars. But actually, they're saying the way humanity is we can take what hurts us and move on from it, and
Yep.
not be pushed into a corner.
Absolutely. And I mean, yeah, and that's exactly what we see. We even see it through biology, right? Of the way that vaccinations work, the way that our immune system works, of taking in a little bit of trauma, a little bit of harm at a time, actually makes us stronger. I mean, we see that from just
See
physicality
it
of
at
the
the
way that we
gym,
work
yeah.
out, yeah. But in pretty much every avenue of just the biology of human, of just, and then also of emotions, like a little bit of hurt, not too much, right? Like there's a line here where safety is good.
Right,
But when we
right,
protect people from everything,
over safety.
we end up pushing away all of the experiences that cause our children and ourselves to grow. Like we need things that push us and test us.
So you shouldn't necessarily trip your kid when he's riding his bike, but you should let him fall.
No, you just push them down, right? Yeah.
No, but usually when he's learning,
Absolutely.
or she's learning, it's good to let them fall and skin their knee
Yeah.
to learn how to do it better.
They need to have those
But they're not saying
experiences.
go ahead and put the
Absolutely.
toe in the spokes.
Yeah, it's not saying that we get rid of all of safety, because safety is good, but we can't just go to the opposite side, which is safetyism, where we try to protect everybody from everything.
Right.
And so that's the first untruth.
All right.
The
And that's
untruth.
what's out there alive in our. See, I took notes on his seminar this week, so this is good.
And so the second truth is the untruth of emotional reasoning. And so the premise of this is that emotions are trustworthy, reliable,
Sorry.
and objective. Therefore, we should act out of our emotions. So the
And
idea
that's
here,
what our culture is saying.
Yep, that's what our culture is saying, that that emotions are deep-seated, they're objective, and that whatever we feel is how we should act.
Now, Ben, is that a long-standing? Have people thought that through all history?
You know, they haven't. Like that, just
No.
historically speaking, from a philosophical place, like that, it's so far removed from what we've seen. Whether that, I mean, from the great philosophers of Buddha all the way to Milton, to Epictetus, like so many of these Stoic philosophers, just so many philosophers, and just the common thread of the mind as we've looked at reasoning is that we need to look at objective reality. We need to look at critical thinking. We need to assess the situation, remove how we immediately feel, and process it, and then try to act. Like, because the reality is, and we all know this, our emotions are hot. Like, we're quick, and we rarely, when we just are reactive, we rarely make the most informed and the best decisions that are nuanced and just take everyone into consideration. Like, we just act. And
the heart is deceitful above all things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the great untruth of emotional reasoning is saying, okay, critical thinking, like taking other people's opinions, really assessing the situation. No. Those aren't the good. That's not the good. The good is that first emotion, those emotions, because that's what the drive should be.
How does it make me feel?
Yep. And that's just dangerous. And then as that got picked up, it eventually led into the concept of microaggressions, which began to redefine what trauma was again. And then whether something was intentional or even unintentional. So that's a shift from when we're just thinking of hurt and difficulty or mistakes, of the shift from intent to impact. So the intent of,
Huh.
did you mean to do it? And then impact, what actually happened. So the intent is, if someone tries to murder someone and fails, the intent is they're still guilty because they tried, even though the impact is small.
Yeah.
Then impact is just the opposite of, you accidentally, someone dies from something you didn't mean for that to happen, but the impact is still is really big. Like, intent matters. And so when we begin taking the intent away from the situation, we're gonna, like, everybody, if someone accidentally does something that hurts our feelings now, like, we make them into an enemy. Like, they're antagonists.
Right.
Like, so, which then naturally is going to lead us into the third untruth.
So because safetyism, the first untruth,
Yeah.
you know, we got to protect everyone at all costs, because whatever doesn't kill you wounds you and makes you weaker.
Absolutely.
So that's a bad thing. And then you add that to emotional reasoning, where just be led by your feelings, and I'm getting weaker if I'm in any danger. And then that leads us to,
Yeah, this final untruth, which is the untruth of us versus them. And so, again, as you kind of walk these out, of safetyism and then emotional reasoning, you can quickly see if we're reducing our tolerance of what's harmful and what's traumatic, and then we're making it about how we feel, how very quickly we can get to the point where if anyone says anything that makes me feel uncomfortable, they must be against me, and they must be antagonists, and then therefore they must be enemies, us versus them. And then what you take that mixed with just really the deep-seatedness of our heart, like the way that they look at it as an evolutionary bent of human mind to seek out tribalism and to be tribalistic people. What we know is it's just a sin of heart, a heart of sin, not a sin of heart, a heart of sin. Like, we just have sinful hearts that want to have people around us and surrounding us that are saying, man, you are right. Like, I do agree with you. And we just quickly want to surround ourselves with voices that agree with us and push away voices that disagree. And what that naturally is going to do is create a culture of tribalism. Because when we only hear voices that we like, we end up becoming more extreme than we ever meant to be, what we ever foundationally were.
and why is it so bad to be in a tribe?
Well, just like I was saying, like, you can quickly, that idea of concept creep is going to even expound even faster, because you're only hearing the pros of your side. Like, you're never once hearing the other argument, the other side. Like, the truth is, and we don't see that in us versus them, is the other side probably has something good to say. Like, it's like you're not the only side that holds truth and holds something right and has the good perspective. Like, we need reminders of what someone who thinks differently, who sees the world a little differently than we do, has to say about what we're talking about. Like, that's good.
And we need, because of common humanity, they're not evil.
Absolutely.
Like, just because someone comes to a different conclusion on, scripturally, the end times, doesn't mean they're evil.
Yep.
Or on how to run a church, and that's church. Well, let's go to how to do school. Let's go to how to do, public policy on different things. And what happens is, when I'm only hearing my voices,
Absolutely.
I'm just being reinforced into my views, and then everyone else, obviously they're idiots or they're evil if they don't agree with these views that all these voices have said, because I've only listened to my tribe. I think
Yep.
it's gospel. So aside from all this, I think it's gospel that we seek out those that disagree with us, so that we can grow in empathy
For sure.
towards them. I don't have to agree with them, and I shouldn't. I'm not saying ideas don't matter. They have consequences.
Yeah.
If that's the whole thing what we're saying. But man, to limit ourselves, it means we make people who disagree with us idiots or evil. And I think it's very unhelpful.
Absolutely. And yeah, we need people who see the world differently with a little word in our ear.
So tell us about what they said about the two types of identity politics.
Yeah, so naturally, when you take this condition of the human heart and all of us, and then you apply what is known as just politics, you're naturally going to quickly get into this idea of identity politics, where you're looking at things based on not just what you do, but who you are and who you resonate with. So your gender, your race, things like that, like identifying things. And so the book walks us through two major forms of identity politics. The first one is common humanity identity politics, which an example of that is Dr. King. Like Dr. King, through that, repeatedly used the metaphor of family and referring to the people who followed him and just others as brothers and sisters.
Well, all humanity.
All humanity as brothers and sisters. You're right. And so what I loved is, and they say this in the book, that King's approach made it clear that his movement would not destroy America, it would repair and reunite it. His mission was to bring people together about a commonality of our humanity. It's like, look, we're in this together and we can move forward together and face this problem. Like, we need to face this together. Like, it's a togetherness.
And the problem is there, and the problem is real.
And so it's not glossing over the problem just for unity's sake.
Sure.
But it's saying, look, we're stronger together and we have these things in common. We're not, instead of just focusing on all the differences, it's focusing on what do you share? What commonalities do you have? And then so the other idea, or the other vein of identity politics is very is dissimilar, and it's kind of the opposite of it. So instead of common humanity identity politics, which was Dr. King, we have this idea of common enemy identity politics, which instead of focusing on just what you have in common, like of a greater humanity, it's looking at the really finding the enemies that you all share. They kind of illustrate it with a Bedouin proverb.
Oh,
I know.
wow.
I against my brothers, I and my brothers against my cousins, I and my brothers and my cousins against the world. It's unity against something. And I wonder, like, I don't think it takes long to think, where do we see this in our culture right now? And what are the problems of it? Like, where do you see it, do you think?
Well, interesting, like, you think back to the civil rights movement and with Martin Luther King and those 15, 17, 20 years, and it really was rooted in Scripture and bringing a vision of humanity and addressing a problem and inviting people in. And it was a long process. It was a long process. I mean, everybody's thinking about one of two or both specific examples in 2020 of common enemy politics.
Absolutely.
On the one hand is the riots, not the protests, but the riots that have been going on in these different cities over the summer. There's a real need for a change in, how the policing happens and how the follow-up on injustices and excessive brutality and so forth. And the rioting is not the way to do it. It's just saying we're going to stick it to whoever's in front of us. And that's a common enemy thing, and gathering more to get into that. That's one thing, and that's terrible. You look at Antifa and Black Lives Matter, and then you look at folks, .com folks, and then folks on the other side responding KKK. I don't even know. Like, I honestly don't even know all of that, but I'm just watching all that bad stuff go on, and that's just common enemy all over the place. And I also think, the way President Trump runs his campaigns is common enemy and gins up sort of support for what he wants to get done through treading down others. I don't think that's helpful, but it seems to be effective for him. And that remains to be seen. It was in 2016. We'll see in 2020. But I think he's actually not appealing to common humanity. And I think he could, because I think his policies are much better than his publicity. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But I do think he's appealing to the common enemy principle. But there's two examples right here that we're seeing sort of on maybe both sides of the political spectrum. But it's not easy. It's the us versus them, really, I think, is of all of them, well, not really, it maybe is the most immediate one. I mean, emotional reasoning is a disaster. Like everybody sees that. But the second great untruth, but the us versus them. Ben, here's the question. What do they say? Like, how did we get here? And I know probably they wrote a lot of pages on it, but how did we get here quickly? Like, what are some of the things that they say, here's a thread that got us to where we are? And I'll tell you my favorite one after.
Oh, wow. Okay. I think the one, I don't know, they give 6, and so I'm trying to think through which one I found most helpful. I really enjoyed getting to read through the first one, which is the Polarization Cycle. And so it's this idea that so they look just specifically at the U.S., and so they're saying the U.S. has experienced a steady increase in at least one form of polarization since the 1980s. So effective, people identify with either of the two main political parties increasingly hate and fear the other party and the people in it. So it's this idea of like the further down this route that we're getting of us versus them, the further apart and polarized people are getting. And it's not just politically, but it's across the board. It seems that we just, what feels like it used to be closer, like when we disagree, we're so much further apart. And the problem is when the further you get away, the less middle ground and the less you have in common.
Right, and
And
and the way we got there was 24-hour news cycles and then screens that are always feeding us different news that the algorithms want us to have. Like, it's just really, so one of the threads to the three great untruths is this polarizing cycle that is just everywhere.
Yep.
And it just is. So this is just diagnosis. This isn't,
Yep. And part of that's exactly what you said, which is, so the technology we have in our hands, right? So our phones, or even just whatever screens we have, a lot of it, whether it's on social media or just our emails or whatever it is, like so much of news is funneling us further and further onto one side or the other. Like we're not getting the voice from both sides that often keeps us going, okay, like I may land over here, but I at least understand what's over here.
Right.
Now it's going, okay, you must be the enemy if you're over here.
Right.
We just continuously getting polarized and polarized to the point where we have no common ground anymore. At least that's the way we feel.
Yeah. Another of the threads they say, and I'd love to just skip this one, but I want to say it, is especially in the safetyism side, is actually a rise in depression and anxiety. So you can read the book and delve into that, or we can do a whole daily grace. But I want to get to the next two because they're really interesting for us as people right here. Third thread that they identify is paranoid parenting, or maybe we've heard helicopter parenting, where parents are all up in things. If you think your kid is fragile, you're going to be all up in their stuff to smooth everything out for them and help them along. And ultimately, if kids are anti-fragile and need to scrape their knees a few times, that's not helping them to not let them scrape their knee.
And one of the problems of that is it ends up becoming a feedback loop, right? So you see your kid having one problem, you're like, okay, I've got to protect them from ever having that situation again, which then naturally can make them a little bit more fragile. And you go, okay, see, it's the culture, like, or things are making this worse. I got to be overprotective, and you just find yourself removing everything.
And then the fourth
Like
one is the decline of free play. So again, for children, decline of free play. And half of you are like, of course, this is what I've been telling my kid as they're raising their kids, the grandparents out there, decline of free play. The more scheduled we are and the more activities there are and the more certifications or qualifications or winning of this and that, and man, kids going out and just rolling around on their bikes with their buddies, that kind of stuff just isn't happening anymore. And when you and me and 6 of our buddies are playing street hockey in Montreal, and we have to figure out whether it's fair or not on our own without a parent coming in. Like, we have to figure out how to do fairness, or we have to figure out how to be hurt but still get into it, or we have to figure out when I'm going to go home crying because you people are so bullying. Like, all that kind of stuff is part of anti-fragile. Anyway, I just found that fascinating, the decline of free play.
It's funny how many social skills are learned like there on the playground. Like that experiential learning of you can learn it in a book, and that's good.
Plus, you eat a little dirt, you build up vaccine.
Absolutely,
No, I'm just kidding.
For sure.
Well, they do talk about a couple other ones, and let's kind of skip over those a little bit, but 2 of them, bureaucracy of safetyism. So more safetyism means more people enforcing safetyism, meaning more people writing little legislation for safety, all that kind of stuff. You can just sort of see it play out. It's fascinating to see. And then the last one is the quest for justice. Tell us just a little bit about that.
Well, it's just, so they kind of walk you through 2 types of justice, distributive justice and procedural justice. And one of the things they kind of walk us through is just we need to understand that correlation does not always imply causation. So one of the things of our culture is we're always looking for everything to be just and right and to be even and fair. And one of the things that kind of walk us through is some of the stats that drive these things are not always saying what they seem to be saying. And so I'll phrase it like this: in many conversations on universities, the correlation of a demographic trait or identity group membership with an outcome gap is taken as evidence that discrimination caused the outcome gap. So it's this idea that statistical disparities don't always mean injustice. So just because of a certain uh, race or certain gender seems to be making up a greater portion of something doesn't mean that there's a major injustice that's happening. And what they're showing light on is seems to be this great quest for justice, which is good and is a right
Absolutely,
thing.
yeah.
We just need to be handling it well and figuring out what's our mechanism to understand of are we actually seeking justice and are we seeking it well? Does that make sense?
It's what it is a teaser. It's an appetizer for someone to read that part of the book and to sort of probe a little deeper, because if correlation and causation are different, and if we're seeing a correlated stat and saying, oh, that's a causing, then that's not helpful. We're not thinking well, but we are getting frustrated and we're letting our emotions drive us.
Absolutely.
And so that's untruth number 2. Okay, where do we go from here? Because we're sort of at the end here. Where do we go from here as believers? So now we're sort of departing from kind of what they wrote, because they're gonna talk about universities, and you and I aren't running a university this week anyway. They're gonna talk about society as a whole and stuff. But as followers of Jesus in the world that is, what are we, what can we be called to? What courage or correction can we take from this?
Do you want to go first? Do you want me to go first?
You always first.
Oh, absolutely. I'll steal one that.
Wait, not that one.
Nah. I'll go to the second one. It's much more in my vein, which is I think we need to protect ourselves from safetyism in a sense of how we're raising our kids. We need to be intentionally raising uncoddled kids. Because right now, I think we have an idol of comfort in our lives, and it's such an easy draw there. Like, I remember it in my own life I used to play outside all the time, and then I got an Xbox. Like, and I love the way they phrase it is it's a problem of progress. Like, it's just as you progress forward, you get new things, you get new responsibilities. How do you handle those? It doesn't mean we throw everything out. Doesn't mean students are welcome. Doesn't mean we get rid of the Xbox or we necessarily get rid of the phones or whatever these new things of progress are. But it does mean we need to come up with ways of how do we keep our kids safe in them and not overprotect them through it. So, and that's such a hard line to walk, is how do we put some stressors and stimuli in our students' lives that will help them take steps forward, but also protect them from real harms and real difficulties that are out there that they need to be protected from. So how, like, we need to really, I think, save our kids from an idol of comfort and actually invite them into a little bit of healthy, practical suffering of maybe we need to work and you do need to get outside, and it is good to play, and it is good to be in arguments, and sometimes it's okay to have to make hard decisions, because a little suffering promotes a lot of life. It's funny that the life that can come from a lot of effort and a lot of struggle. What do you think?
Yeah, no, that's really good. I also think we all, probably each one of us, could do a little bit of am I coddled audit? Do I have a coddled mind? Am I kind of buying into these untruths and not realizing it, that safety is everything? I honestly think in COVID, we need to be careful not to let the fear of the disease drive our lives. We don't want to give a veto over God's calling on our lives to the fear of catching the disease.
Yep.
Like we don't give a veto. I mean, every time you get behind the wheel of a car, you can get in a car accident and die, or worse, kill someone. But you still drive. But you do it carefully, and you do it with proper training and with, So I just think, okay, let's call it. Now that's just one example because it's live right here. Called emotional reasoning. Like, am I following my reason? One friend was telling me that he was counseling. He's a pastor in a different city, and he was counseling with a guy who had been coming to his church, and the guy was ready to leave his wife, and had lunch with the pastor, and couldn't believe the pastor actually said, no, well, what about your vows, and what about God's future for you? Because he thought, the pastor was just supposed to help him be happy, because that's what, doesn't God want me to be happy? Like, that's just living by your feelings.
Yep.
That's sort of apart from, but like, there you go. Like, am I doing that? Is there that possibility there? Am I letting feelings drive everything? And then am I looking at others who disagree with me as morally inferior, or as intellectually inferior, idiots, or as evil? that's just worth us kind of gritting again and again. Like, I don't want to buy into that untruth of us versus them. We are a common humanity. Yeah, we're gonna disagree on issues, and we're gonna work for the issue we think, but it's not because they're evil. It's just because I really think it's a better idea, and let the Lord sort it out. But I think we do a coddled audit. Like, be careful.
Yeah, it's helpful. And
Yeah.
it's just so funny. Like, so many of these things are steps in the direction of safety and comfort. Like, safetyism, we feel like it'll bring flourishing if we can just protect everything everyone from everything. Even emotional reasoning, like, we don't have to put in the hard work of deciphering the reality of the situation or how other people are feeling or what's going on over here or understanding the argument over here if all that matters is what we think. And then it's also just, it can be lazy just to go us versus them, that if you're not where I am, you must be the enemy.
That's right.
Like, it's so interesting to think of how much of these things can come from an idol of just comfort and some other things, absolutely, but just also from there.
Yeah. So they do make one statement that maybe we can kind of land on, which I think is super, super helpful, just sort of to summarize all of this. What is it?
It's kind of this big question, right? That they'll land us, that we have to land on, I think, today, which is this: do you prepare the child for the road, or the road for the child? What do you think?
Well, I think so many helicopter parents are preparing the road for the child, smoothing every obstacle out. And because my kid is here and I just got to make the way. But I think ultimately they're saying, and I think ultimately Scripture's saying, is go ahead and prepare the child for the road. Go ahead and prepare us for reality as it really is. Make sure we're living and thinking and feeling into the reality as it really is.
Yeah.
I think it's great. Are we preparing the child for the road or the road for the child?
Yep. And so I think as we look at these three untruths, the clear answer is we need to prepare our children for the road that God has them on, not try to prepare the path, because the path is bumpy. There is struggle. There will be suffering. If we prepare the children for the road, they will be successful walking it through.
This is a fallen world, but aren't you so thankful for Isaiah 40, where one day the Lord is going to make the crooked places plain? And when he comes back, it's going to be a whole different story. We won't need books like this, but right now we're in a broken world, and the road is tough, and we got to live in the world that is. Hey, we have taken a lot of time, but it's a very important thing. It's germane to every one of us watching this. Share this with your friends. Encourage folks to take 25, 30 minutes and grow and think and wrestle. And let's watch God raise us all up in him. So thank you for joining us today. Ben, thank you for the hard work you've done.
Absolutely.
And we'll see you next time. Yeah.